Hey everybody, it's the Jimmy Dore Show. I'm Aaron Maté, sitting in for Jimmy, here with Americans comedian Kurt Metzger. And let's talk about what's happening in Brazil. Here's the headline from The Guardian. Lula vows to punish neo-fascists after Bolsonaro supporters storm Congress. Brazilian President Lula da Silva has toured the wreckage of his presidential palace after an extraordinary day of political violence in the capital, Brasilia, saw thousands of far-right extremists riot through the country's democratic institutions in a failed attempt to overthrow his week-old government. Shocking video footage showed pro-Bolsonaro militants sprinting up the ramp into the Palácio do Planalto, the presidential offices, roaming the building's corridors and vandalizing the nearby Supreme Court, whose windows had been smashed. Here's a video of that. There it is. Lula was not in Brasilia at the time of the attack, but he gave an angry speech blaming Bolsonaro for the chaos and promising that anyone involved will be punished. Bolsonaro, of course, was Lula's predecessor, who, upon Lula's entry into office, after Lula defeated him in a recent vote, Bolsonaro fled to the U.S. Now he is in Miami. And allies of Bolsonaro conspired to imprison Lula while Bolsonaro was the president. So it's a very fraught situation right now. Military police in Brasilia were conspicuous by their absence on Sunday, and the mobs faced little opposition as they marched toward three branches of government. On Sunday night, the Supreme Court justice ordered Ibanez Rocha, the pro-Bolsonaro governor of the federal district where Brasilia is located, to be removed from his post for 90 days amid outrage that authorities failed to prevent the attack. Well, let me bring in two guests now. Joining us from Sao Paulo, Brazil, is Camila Escalante. She is editor at Costichin News and a Latin American correspondent for Press TV. And we're also joined by Michael Fox. He is a Brazil-based journalist and the host of the podcast Brazil on Fire. Welcome to you both. Camila, I'll start with you. Talk to us about where you are and what's happening.
Well, I'm in Sao Paulo, and there was a massive march here. There have been marches all day, mobilizations in all the state capitals of Brazil, and other actions also in small towns repudiating what took place yesterday. People here, of course, call it terrorism. They say that this was an act carried out by fascists, by those loyal to, as you said, Jair Bolsonaro, and they want to make sure that their vote, which took place on October 30th, is respected. They want to make sure that the social movements here do their part in order to maintain the government in power because of all the threats that have taken place. Obviously, the PT government of Dilma Rousseff suffered a coup, and they believe that they're the ones who brought Lula to the presidency and this government, and they are ensuring that their project gets pushed from the bottom. So here we have social movements from across the social movement spectrum. We're talking the urban housing movements, as well as the land reform and agrarian reform movements. We have football teams here. There are fan clubs that are anti-fascist fan clubs. The biggest and loudest one here is Corinthians. If you're familiar with Sao Paulo or Brazilian football, there's actually 4 different Sao Paulo football fan clubs here, and they all kind of call themselves anti-fascist. And that is that they participate in a lot of these sorts of mobilizations, denouncing racism, denouncing xenophobia, and denouncing hate that they say has been carried out in a systematic way by not only Bolsonaro, but his allies and a lot of the other right-wing politicians around the country, particularly since Bolsonaro became more prominent on the political scene here. So this march has gone down Paulista Avenue. It's the large avenue here, very important, and it's tens of thousands of people. And this has been taking place similarly across the country all day. We're seeing images of massive crowds in all parts of the country. People are really angry. They're demanding, they're saying no amnesty. They don't want to see any impunity for what took place. The vandalism, what they consider to be violent attacks, And, it's not just what took place yesterday in Brasilia that they're denouncing. They want to see a total dismantling now with the decree that was signed by Lula yesterday of all of the protest camps, so-called protest camps, all of the different actions, road blockades that are taking place across the country, many of which have fizzled out, but some of which continue in a lot of the states controlled by right-wing governors. So they want to see those completely come to an end. They are having a slight economic impact, but they do impact people's day-to-day lives.
Michael Fox, for people who are not familiar with Brazilian politics and the backstory here, what is the important background that we should know about what just took place?
Wow. We can go back a long way, but I won't, I promise. Look, it's important to remember 2016, Dilma Rousseff, then president, is ousted in a constitutional coup, in a congressional coup that takes her from office, right? She was obviously Lula's former chief of staff, who had come to power, and she was in power for roughly 6 years after Lula had been around for about 8 years. She's ousted. And during that time, then Lula is jailed. He's jailed back in 2018 in the lead up to the 2018 elections. He's yet on trumped up charges, which are then tossed out by courts, and all the other accusations against him are all tossed out by different courts. But his jailing enables Bolsonaro to come to power. And what he pushes and what he brings to Brazil is what some people call a pseudo-fascism, what some people call a fascism. It's the Trump of the tropics. He brings in, policies that are clearly pro-white supremacy, racist, full-on backlash against social movements, black communities, indigenous communities, and that's what he unrolls around the country. And during his time in office, the parallels between the United States are really, really key here, Aaron. We have to understand that it's all very, very similar to what we saw with Trump. And during this time, he keeps his supporters energized by telling them that they need to get out on the streets, they need to protest, that other people are trying to stop him from doing what he wants to do. And he starts to create these anti-democratic protests. He gets people out in the streets to march against the Supreme Court, to march against Congress, telling them they're trying to push back on his government. And of course, Bolsonaro is a former captain in the Brazilian dictatorship who's called for dictatorship for forever. He's called for coups for forever. And so this is all the context within which we see this. Of course, we understand that he left 2 days early. He kind of fled or flew to the United States 2 days before Lula's inauguration. Lula comes to power officially. Of course, he's elected back in late October by more than 2 million votes. Lula comes to power. He's inaugurated on January 1st, and huge mobilizations, 200,000 people for the inauguration, just this amazing sense of hope. And then, of course, just yesterday, Bolsonaro's people hit the streets and move in, push their way into the Capitol in a copycat image of January 6th. Very, very clear that this was not just influenced, but coordinated and organized with the support and with the collusion of people like Steve Bannon and whatnot in the United States, and of course Bolsonaro. And they attack the three, they attack the Supreme Court, Palácio Planalto, which of course is Lula's presidential palace, and Congress, and just wreak havoc, creating so much devastation. So, I mean, that's the context. You have to understand that Bolsonaro was essentially pushing for this the entire time, pushing fake news, incentivizing hate, incentivizing violence. And that's what his people, ultimately did yesterday in this just insane copycat. What's important just to understand is that what Lula's inauguration a week ago, what that represented was the return of democracy for so many people, the return of hope, going back to 6 years, going back to that coup against Dilma Rousseff. And what this was is a failed attempt that we saw yesterday by Bolsonaro's supporters to oust Lula, with the hope, of course, that then the military would rise up in their defense, and then Bolsonaro would fly in. And part of this is because they actually believe this. This is what they've been seeing and hearing over Twitter. People over the far-right Twitter sphere in Brazil have been talking about the potential for that, oh, don't worry, just keep holding on. The military's going to rise up, and Bolsonaro's going to be back soon. So that's kind of the general context. Of course, that's really broad, but that's what we're looking at right.
And I think I made a mistake. I said that Lula was jailed under Bolsonaro. Is it actually that he was jailed to prevent him from running against Bolsonaro? Is that what happened?
That's exactly what it was. He was jailed in April of 2018. Yeah. Bolsonaro came into power. Now, what's important here, though, is the man who jailed him, his jailer, former judge, Sergio Moro, who was the head of the car wash operation, was then brought on as Bolsonaro's justice minister. And then Lula was then freed 580 days after he was jailed, so about 9 months into Bolsonaro's presidency.
Right. Camila, talk to us more about who these protesters, these rioters are, and what they did when they attacked these government buildings.
Oh, sorry. I'm being told that I should maybe move because there might be clashes between the two sides. But I'll keep talking. So, like this is a big part of the investigation that began yesterday, that began immediately once, Lula got off the air from where he was in the interior city of Sao Paulo. He said that, we're going to hold these people accountable. We're going to hold them to justice, and we're going to do so swiftly. One of the things, they've been saying since yesterday, the leader of the president of the Workers' Party, Gleisi Hoffmann, as well as Lula, in his statements yesterday afternoon, they've been saying we need to look into agribusiness. We need to look into those who have illegal mining and illegal logging interests. And the reason is, this camp that's taking place in Brasilia, which should be dismantled today, it's not something that people just came and showed up and they're just kind of hanging out and having like kind of a outdoorsy time. It's actually, there are videos circulating online that shows that they have extremely high quality and large amounts of meat. They're having huge cookouts. They're having barbecues. I mean, they're living really well. They have all of the amenities for a really nice camp out. So, they're getting this as donations, and they're getting a lot of funds and resources and material support from someone. So one of the things that has been investigated that they said right off the bat yesterday, the Minister of Justice said that they had identified those who had paid for the buses. They said 40 buses. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but 40 buses had bussed in people from other states to participate in this, action, coup attempt, whatever you want to call it. They weren't people who were necessarily already in this protest camp by the army barracks. They're people who came from different states. This costs money. They say they have the names, they've identified those people. But in addition, they are looking into the hotels. They have requested that the hotels send the names and hand over, the people who have entered Brasilia and have been staying in the last few days since January 5th, because they said a lot of people have come apart from the activities that took place around the inauguration. That was on January 1st. That ended. And so a whole lot of other people came just days before this storming of the Esplanade. And so they're going to be looking into who those people are. So it's going to get really loud here for a second.
All right, Camila, let's...
Very eventful here.
No, it's you're right in the thick of it. It sounds better now.
Okay, so what I was going to say is, there's a lot of speculation, particularly from the U.S. journalists and people who are kind of, concerned with what happened here and comparing it to January 6th. And, one of the questions they've asked, maybe Mike Fox is a little more plugged into U.S. politics and everything, is in what way was there some sort of cooperation with U.S. figures such as Steve Bannon, such as, let's say, right-wing Fox News TV hosts? Or do they have some sort of communication with Jair Bolsonaro supporters here in Brazil? These are really important questions to ask. They will all be a part of the investigation. But it's also really important to ask, although there could be some sort of support for what's going on here from the United States agencies and personalities in the United States, to really get to the bottom of who's behind this within Brazil. Within Brazil, there are countless different interests, as I said, as well as, those sorts of partnerships with the transnationals, all of which have very specific interests in the different territories in the Amazon. And, they know that, Lula might have all sorts of different policies. We might call them social democratic, but we know that he has made some very firm commitments to the indigenous communities and Afro-descendant peoples, particularly in the Amazon, in the North, in the Northeast, people that have been historically marginalized and very vulnerable, having to do with his policies towards the environment. So this is what needs to be investigated right now.
Michael Fox, if there's anything you want to add to that, and also you mentioned earlier that there's the goal among some supporters of Bolsonaro to trigger a military revolt. Do you see any prospect of that happening?
So I would just add that Camila's right on. From what I heard, there was actually 100 buses or more. There have now been, and just to kind of give some of the latest figures, because Camila's been on the street doing it like throughout the day, interviewing people, and it's amazing. And mad props to Camila, because she's like here 1 minute, she's over in Bolivia another, covering the attempted coup in Bolivia. It's just amazing. But the latest figures I just saw, there are some reports that as many as 1,200 Bolsonaro supporters have now been arrested in Brasilia. And the images that we've seen throughout the day of many of those pro-Bolsonaro camps being taken down, and that's happening around the country. So that was one of the requests, not the requests, but the mandates from the Supreme Court Justice Alexandre Moraes, who issued 9 different measures, decrees essentially, last night, saying, listen, the most important one being we need to take down every single one of these Bolsonaro camps. Now, I don't know if all of them have been taken down around the country, but we've been seeing images across the day, seeing them being taken down. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, though the camp in Brasilia has been taken down. There was concerns last night around this because there was almost a standoff between the military police and then the military themselves. Between the military police had been action in order to take down the camp, and then many of these camps are in front of the military barracks, and so there's a question over jurisdiction. So this kind of begs your question, right? What you were just saying, Aaron, about is there any concern that some of them might actually, the military might actually want to stand up, kind of potentially in defense of some of these Bolsonaro supporters? And what we're seeing so far is that the military is complying with the mandates from the Supreme Court, and that goes in line with what we've expected. There are obviously members of the Brazilian military that support Bolsonaro. There's a smaller group of members of the military that have always been in favor of dictatorship, that didn't want to return to a democracy back in the mid '80s, and would love to see a coup scenario and return to democracy. I mean, to a dictatorship. So obviously they are ones that are in support of Bolsonaro, and they have gotten more positions of clout, or they gained more positions of clout during the Bolsonaro government. So obviously there are those sectors, and there was obviously collusion between the military police with, it's the same thing that happened in D.C., the exact same thing, where the police basically just opened the doors and they moved out of the way and said, okay, go on in. Now, it's also important to remember that, and I think Camila had mentioned this in the beginning, the man in charge of security for Brasilia was the former Minister of Justice under Bolsonaro. So after Bolsonaro left, then he became the man in charge of security for Brasilia. He has now fled to the United States. In fact, he left even before things went down in Brasilia yesterday, and now at this point he's been fired. And so that happened, of course, once Lula said, all right, we are declaring intervention, federal intervention into the police force in Brasilia to take action to make things happen. And that's what we're seeing around the country. So all signs point to the fact that the military is going to comply. It's going to go along with the Lula administration. This is what we've been seeing for a very long time. And why is that? Because they don't have, there is no support within the elites, the Brazilian elites, to do some sort of crazy coup scenario. The people that have been on the streets, the people that attack and sack Brasilia, are a small minority sector of Bolsonaro supporters. And so that's, of course, and they don't want to lose, the military doesn't want to lose its clout that it's gained over the last, 30 or 40 years since the end of the dictatorship for someone like Bolsonaro. And so that's kind of where things stand right now. It is actually potentially a very positive scenario for Lula, because it means that the rest of the country might actually rally around Lula and really put Bolsonaro's back against the wall. And even people who would have voted for Bolsonaro might be more than willing to give Lula a try, because, of course, they don't want to be in cahoots with people that are breaking the government buildings, something like we've never seen in the history of Brazil.
Camila, as Michael said, you have a lot of experience covering events like this across Latin America. Anything else you want to add that stands out to you from the reporting you've done so far in Brazil?
Well, I have to say, every single time I cover something like this, the way you characterize it, it's completely different. Sometimes there are some similarities. There are similarities, overlaps in what's going on in Bolivia and Peru, with the coup that's going on. But I want to stress again what I just said earlier about the material support being provided for these pro-Bolsonaro cells. It's not typical. You have to think about the character of the people who are, participating in these camps and these protests. I've been to Bolsonarista protests here in Sao Paulo. They might actually be here now. They were given 24 hours to be dismantled, and so they're probably leaving today. We have social movements, in this country that organize on a mass scale. And it's highly sophisticated organizing. I mean, as far as if we're comparing it to any of the popular organizations in other countries, but obviously in North America, there's no sort of articulation like that. So when you see a social movement at a protest and they have a tent or a truck or a sound truck, it's like one. And we know how they get their money. In the case of the landless workers movement, they literally produce food, and some of it is, sold within the country. Other things are actually exported internationally. There's all sorts of ways that these social movements maintain themselves. In the case of these Bolsonaristas, if you go to the protest, it's a lot of individuals. It is not these celebrity right-wing talking people on talk radio, or the sorts of podcasters that have these sorts of far-right extremist commentary. It's not all celebrities. It's actually a lot of very, I would say, humble working-class people with no real affiliation to, a lot of right-wing groups. They might not be a member of a party. It's not anyone who could come together and assemble that sort of a demonstration with all of the tents, with all of the trailers and the toilets and everything that they have going on. They are getting tons of money funneled to them in order to carry this out, and it needs to be traced back to its roots. But I do have to say as well, this is a very large country by population, but the mobilization that we saw in favor of Lula, it's going to get really loud again because
All right, you know what? What we'll do is go to a break, and we'll come right back, and we'll have more with our guests talking about what's happening with the violence in Brazil and the violent protests against the government of Lula da Silva.
Everybody, we're doing live stand-up comedy in Los Angeles in January and February in Los Angeles. And then we're going to Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Nashville. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets and become a premium member while you're there.